In this video, I want to introduce a fascinating saint of the Hindu religion. This is Sri Ramakrishna, an all but illiterate mystic who lived in India during the 19th century. He effectively synthesized vastly different forms of Hinduism and proclaimed, in addition, that all religions lead to God. I mentioned Sri Ramakrishna in a conversation I had with Lucas Vos, in which we were discussing the role of individuality in relation to love. In that video, which I'll link to in the description below, I noted that even Ramakrishna, who had experienced the fullest degree of union and identity with God, preferred to maintain a sense of separate individuality. As he put it, the devotee of God wants to eat sugar, not to become sugar. This video will introduce his life and teachings, but will focus in particular on what we in the modern West can learn from him, whether we are religious, non-religious, or somewhere in between. I believe that Ramakrishna's wisdom can help us better understand the nature of God, or the ground of being, the relation of this ground to the world itself, and the nature of the man known as Jesus Christ. Finally, I believe it can contribute to a view of reality that affirms both its immanent and transcendent aspects, both the world as it actually is in all its glory, and the pure and perfect One beyond all this, in whom all this is grounded. First, a note on the name. Sri is an honorific or sign of respect, much as we're to fix the word saint in front of the name of a Christian saint. Ramakrishna is also known as Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, a title that literally means supreme swan and signifies his enlightened status. Sri Ramakrishna was born to a poor family in the small Bengali village of Kamarpukur in 1836. As a child, he showed an intense interest in religion and sometimes experienced ecstatic states in which he lost all outward consciousness. The first time this happened, he was walking across a field when he saw a flock of milky white cranes flying against the backdrop of black storm clouds. The sight was so beautiful that he fell down, scattering the rice snacks he was carrying. Another time was when he was portraying the god Shiva for a festival. In 1852, at age 16, Ramakrishna left his village. He had acquired only the most basic education at the village school. His brother, Ram Kumar, a priest, had moved to Calcutta and wanted Ramakrishna to assist him. In 1855, the pair took up residence at the newly established Dakshineswar temple dedicated to the goddess Kali, where Ram Kumar had just been appointed priest. This is where Ramakrishna spent virtually all the rest of his life. The following year his brother died, but had trained Ramakrishna to succeed him. So, at age 20, Ramakrishna took up the daily worship of Kali at Dakshineswar. He became more and more immersed in devotion to Kali, the Divine Mother, spending nearly all his time worshipping her, singing to her, or meditating on her. He was consumed by a longing to see her, to experience a vision of her, as it was said that her greatest saints and devotees had been granted. One day, in desperation, and despairing of a life without her vision, he suddenly seized a sword that hung in her shrine, intending to end his life that now seemed worthless. At that very moment, he was granted a marvelous vision of the Divine Mother and fell down unconscious. Here is how he later described what he experienced. Quote, "What I saw was a boundless, infinite, conscious sea of light. However far in whichever direction I looked, I found a continuous succession of effulgent waves coming forward, raging and storming from all sides with great speed. Very soon they fell on me and made me sink into the unknown bottom. I panted, struggled, and fell unconscious. I did not know what happened then in the external world, how that day and the next slipped away, but in my heart of hearts there was flowing a current of intense bliss, never experienced before, and I had the immediate knowledge of the light that was Mother." End quote. Convinced of Mother Kali's existence, Sri Ramakrishna's devotion intensified even further, and he was granted many more visions of the Mother, many of them of a far more personal nature than the first. He would see the goddess in a personal form, would speak with her, eat with her, laugh and dance with her. The nature of his worship became far from orthodox. Though some considered his strange behavior a sign of his sanctity, others thought he must be mad. In the hopes of grounding and stabilizing him in the world, his family arranged Ramakrishna's marriage. It is said that, in an ecstatic state, he predicted exactly where they would find his future wife. She would be known as Sharada Devi and would come to be revered as an enlightened teacher in her own right. They were formally married in 1859, but as she was a child at the time, it wasn't until 1872 that she first came to stay with him. By then, Ramakrishna had thoroughly renounced the pleasures and attachments of the world, and their marriage was never consummated. He considered her a manifestation of the Divine Mother, and once literally worshipped her as such. After his vision of Kali, Sri Ramakrishna began practicing the various different spiritual paths of Hinduism. Hinduism being a far less unitary phenomenon than other religions, in some ways more like a collection of related religions. It seems to me that almost all the different religious tendencies across the world have arisen and found expression within the Hindu family of traditions. There is, for instance, polytheism, pantheism, panentheism, multiple different monotheisms, the purest and most abstract non-dualism, devotional movements full of emotion, yogic exercises, esoteric magic, stoic dedication to duty, the most intense ascetic self-denial, the sensuous celebration of the world, and so on and so on. What is wonderful about Ramakrishna is how he brings so many of these tendencies together and synthesizes them in a way that seems completely natural. That is why I think he is such an important figure, not only for Hinduism, but for the whole world. Anyway, at this point in his life, Sri Ramakrishna began practicing other Hindu paths beyond the worship of Kali. This included devotion to Krishna and Rama, who were considered ancient incarnations of God. True to his nature, the lengths he went to in this were extreme. In his worship of Rama, for example, he embodied his most devoted companion, the monkey god Hanuman, acting like a monkey, dwelling in trees, and even eating the food that monkeys eat. In his devotion to Krishna, he assumed the dress and mannerisms of a woman. Through all his experiences with other deities, he found that they led to the same supreme being, to that which he experienced in his vision of Kali. In 1861, he was initiated into the esoteric tradition of Tantra by a wandering female ascetic named Bhairavi Brahmani, and quickly progressed through the 64 stages of practice. He found that this too was consonant with everything else he had experienced thus far. Finally, in 1864, he was initiated into Advaita Vedanta by a wandering monk named Totapuri. As an adherent of Advaita or non-dualism, Totapuri believed only in the absolute Brahman, the one, pure, universal consciousness that dwells behind the veil of illusion or Maya. He therefore regarded Sri Ramakrishna's devotion to the goddess Kali with scorn. Like the world itself, all the particular deities people worshipped, with all their particular forms, all of this was vain illusion. Totapuri instructed Ramakrishna to free his mind from everything and merge it in meditation on the pure self. But whenever Ramakrishna tried to do this, the beloved vision of Mother Kali appeared before him, blocking his progress. Hearing of his difficulty, his guru took a piece of broken glass and pressed it into Ramakrishna's forehead in the position of the third eye, telling him to focus his mind at that point with a firm determination. When Kali appeared to him again, he cut her in two with the sword of knowledge and broke through to the ultimate samadhi, or the highest degree of union with the Absolute. He remained motionless for 3 days before eventually being roused by Totapuri, who recognized his spiritual mastery. He had achieved in 1 day what it had taken himself 40 years of intense discipline to attain. Through this experience, Ramakrishna realized the oneness of the non-dual Brahman and his beloved mother Kali. Rather than casting away his worship of the mother, he saw it in a new light. Against the Advaitic notion that the world was an illusion, Ramakrishna would emphasize that God has become the whole world. This more immanent and active aspect of God is the Divine Mother. Though Totapuri resisted this insight at first, he was eventually persuaded by his own vision of Kali and departed from Dakshineswar temple after bowing down in worship to the mother. After Totapuri's departure, Ramakrishna remained for 6 months in a near-continuous state of samadhi, experiencing his identity with ultimate reality. He remained utterly motionless and was only kept alive by a sympathetic monk who forcibly fed him in the brief moments he regained some awareness of the world. At the end of this period, Ramakrishna heard a command from the Divine Mother to remain in a lesser state of consciousness, one that verged on this total absorption, yet also allowed him to be aware of and live in the world. Still, he would often lapse back into that ultimate state, especially when spurred by talk or singing of God. Ramakrishna also had experiences with Islam and Christianity, though each admittedly was brief and probably not very satisfactory to the followers of those religions. Nevertheless, during these encounters, he lost all interest in the Hindu gods, and each of them culminated in a radiant figure, Muhammad and Christ, appearing to him and merging into him. He was convinced that these religions too were paths to God and kept images of Christ in his room, among other deities and spiritual masters, to whom he burnt incense every day. Gradually, word of the strange saint at Dakshineswar spread and people flocked to meet him. A group of dedicated disciples formed around him. Every day he would discuss spiritual topics, instruct them, and sing the glories of God with them. Though Ramakrishna never wrote down his teachings, many of these meetings were recorded in the diary of a disciple and later published as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, from which I will be quoting throughout this video. In 1885, Ramakrishna developed throat cancer and was moved out of Dakshineswar temple to a house to be cared for by his disciples. He gave them the ochre-coloured robes of renunciation, thus beginning the Ramakrishna order of monastics, which would later spread all over the world. He died the following year, at 50 years of age. His chief disciple, Swami Vivekananda, is considered instrumental in bringing Hindu philosophy to the West when he spoke at the Parliament of World Religions in Chicago in 1893. Even during his life, Ramakrishna was held to be an avatar, or an incarnation of God. Vivekananda, like Totapuri before him, followed a more intellectual path, gravitated to the non-dual school of Advaita Vedanta, and was deeply skeptical of the idea of avatars, at least initially. What sense did these make if every self was the absolute Brahman and all else was illusion? Now, 2 days before Ramakrishna died, Vivekananda was standing by his bedside when a thought flashed into his mind. Was his master truly a divine incarnation? He would only believe it if he told him this himself. At that moment, Sri Ramakrishna spoke. "Are you still not convinced?" he asked. "He who in the past was born as Rama and Krishna is now living in this very body as Ramakrishna, but not from the standpoint of your Vedanta." I'll turn now to Sri Ramakrishna's teaching. It could be summed up, I think, by saying that the purpose of human life is to realize God, and that ultimately all must be renounced for the sake of this. Referring to the Bhagavad Gita, a key Hindu scripture, he taught, quote, "What is the significance of the Gita? It is what you find by repeating the word 10 times. Then it is reversed into Tagi, which means a person who has renounced everything for God. And the lesson of the Gita is, O man, renounce everything and seek God alone. Whether a man is a monk or a householder, he has to shake off all attachment from his mind. End quote. That's from chapter 3 of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, in the online version I've linked to in the description below. Ramakrishna had both monastic and lay disciples, and he taught, in consonance with the Gita, that even the lay householder could seek and attain God through selfless work and devotion. By offering the fruits of one's work to God, one loosens attachment to the world and strengthens one's love for God. We'll see shortly how the relation of God and the world may be a bit more complex than this seems, but Sri Ramakrishna's call to action was clear: seek God. That quote also illustrates Sri Ramakrishna's style of teaching. He was fond of parables and wordplay, and found ingenious ways to relate the mundane and even scandalous to matters of great spiritual significance. Here is a quote very much in that vein, some advice to his lay disciples about how to seek God while continuing to live in the world. It comes from chapter 25 of the Gospel. Quote, "Live in the world like an unchaste woman. She performs her household duties with great attention, but her mind dwells day and night on her paramour. Perform your duties in the world, but keep your mind always fixed on God." End quote. He continually emphasized spiritual practice and experience over intellectual speculation. Comparing the realization of God to the sweetness of mangoes, he said, quote, "I have come to the garden to eat mangoes. What is the use of my calculating the number of trees, branches, and leaves? I only eat the mangoes. I don't need to know the number of trees and leaves." End quote. And that's from chapter 6 of the Gospel. But to know something of God, whether by hearsay or direct experience, is never to exhaustively comprehend him. As he explained in another parable quoted in chapter 3, quote, "Once an ant went to a hill of sugar. One grain filled its stomach. Taking another grain into its mouth, it started homeward. On its way it thought, 'Next time I shall carry home the whole hill.' That is the way shallow minds think. They don't know that Brahman is beyond one's words and thought. However great a man may be, how much can he know of Brahman?" End quote. But there is another reason why so little can really be said about the ultimate reality. Quote, "Once a salt doll went to measure the depth of the ocean. It wanted to tell others how deep the water was, but this it could never do, for no sooner did it get into the water than it melted. Now who was there to report the ocean's depth?" End quote. This parable alludes to Ramakrishna's own experience. In the highest state of union with the Absolute, this very state involves the dissolution of the ego. Though Ramakrishna denied this was unconsciousness, rather it is pure consciousness, nevertheless there is nothing of the individual mind left to consider and record the experience. This leads to another important teaching. Ultimately, God, or ultimate reality, is non-dual. There is really no distinction between God and the inmost self of every person. No distinction, finally, between God and everything that exists. God is one, the self is one, reality is one. This is the essence of the highest realization, and it appears that Ramakrishna both experienced this in his life and affirmed it in his teachings. Nevertheless, Sri Ramakrishna had a decided preference for bhakti, or loving devotion to God, which is necessarily the attitude of one who feels himself distinct from God. Recall the saying I quoted at the start of this video: "The devotee wants to eat sugar, not to become sugar." That's taken from chapter 5, by the way, and was originally said by the great 18th century devotee of Kali, Ramprasad Sen. I'll go into this in more depth in a minute, but for now suffice it to say that Ramakrishna taught that bhakti was the best and easiest spiritual path for the present age. So long as the individual ego remains, God as a distinct reality is 100% real, and it is best for that ego to feel himself a servant of God. At the same time, however, he fully acknowledged the other paths: jnana, or the path of knowledge, karma, or the path of selfless action, and the various other forms of spiritual discipline or yoga. Perhaps the most striking thing about Sri Ramakrishna, especially for his time, was his universalism. Not only the various different Hindu paths, but all the world's religions lead to God. To illustrate this, he told a parable, and this is quoted in the first chapter of the Gospel. Quote, "The mother cooks different dishes to suit the stomachs of her different children. Suppose she has 5 children. If there is a fish to cook, she prepares different dishes from it. Pilau, pickled fish, fried fish, and so on, to suit their different tastes and powers of digestion." End quote. So all the religions lead to the same God. All the different forms of God are ultimately the same, and God conceived as a personal being is ultimately the same as the completely transcendent and in that sense impersonal ground of being or Brahman. But even more than this, God is also everything. God is the whole world itself, although one must first renounce the world and seek God before one can truly realize this identity. Sri Ramakrishna illustrated this in the following way in chapter 3 of the Gospel. Just a note on the language. A jnani is someone who follows the path of jnana or knowledge, while a vijnani, in Ramakrishna's usage, is a step beyond this. Quote, "The jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating, not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized intuitively as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings." End quote. I'll end my broad overview of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings here. Next, I'm going to discuss some specific areas that I think can be of special help to us in the modern West. Overall, his teachings are, I think, the same as those of all major religions, oriented to an ultimate reality which is of infinite value, for the sake of which all lesser attachments must ultimately be sacrificed. Moral goodness, wisdom, self-discipline, and love, all of these are essential to the religious life. What distinguishes him, though, is his power to synthesize various different paths and conceptions into a coherent whole, and of his tolerance and universalism, which is nevertheless not a kind of anything goes relativism. One useful way to divide the world's religions is into those which are dualistic versus those which are non-dualistic. In the sense relevant here, a dualistic religion sees man and the ultimate reality as different, as two different things. Examples of this are the great Western monotheistic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. God is the highest being, but he created us as beings distinct from him. We can relate to him, but it's not the case that we ultimately are him. There are important qualifications and exceptions to this, of course. For instance, certain mystical tendencies in Judaism and Islam, and certain aspects of Christianity, which I'll talk about later. Hinduism and Buddhism are commonly seen as the chief examples of non-dualistic religions. In Buddhism, all is emptiness, shunyata, although exactly what this means varies between the different Buddhist schools. Although in the West, Hinduism is often seen as the epitome of a non-dualistic religion, as I've mentioned, there is actually tremendous variety within it. Put simply, some traditions of Hinduism are explicitly and insistently dualist, while others are just as forcefully non-dualist, and many are some combination of the two. This diversity is the religious environment Sri Ramakrishna lived in. In non-dualist Hinduism, everything is a manifestation of the same fundamental reality. At the deepest level, God and man are identical. Each man's innermost self is the same one self of the whole universe. The self, Atman, is Brahman, as the traditional formulation goes. The nature of Brahman is Sat, Chit, and Ananda. timeless and pure being, consciousness, and bliss. One can immediately see that these two religious orientations are in tension. If the ultimate reality is a being separate from me, then the aim of life is to get into the right relation with it, to serve and to love it. But if the ultimate reality is my inmost self and beyond all particular forms, the aim of life would seem to be to clarify my awareness to the point where I realize my identity with it. And this is generally how the Hindu schools or religions have divided. Those of a more dualist persuasion emphasize bhakti, or devotion to God, while those of a more non-dualist persuasion emphasize jnana, or knowledge, reasoning, spiritual insight. As we've seen, Sri Ramakrishna practiced both these paths. He worshipped the personal God with intense devotion as Kali and other deities, but he also practiced Advaita Vedanta and attained the highest degree of samadhi, realizing his identity with Brahman. In his teachings, he continually affirmed the non-dual nature of reality, yet at the same time, he consistently recommended bhakti as the most effective path to the same ultimate reality. As quoted in chapter 4 of the Gospel, he once told his disciples, quote, "Bhakti, love of God, is the essence of all spiritual discipline. Through love, one acquires renunciation and discrimination naturally," end quote. And another time in chapter 18, he said, quote, "Everything can be achieved through bhakti alone. Those who want the knowledge of Brahman will certainly achieve that also by following the trail of bhakti," end quote. The love of God gathers and harnesses, rather than suppresses, the natural passions of the individual and directs them toward the ultimate reality. These passions need a form to focus on. Our individual hearts need an individual being to love and adore. But all of this, Ramakrishna assures us, brings us to that reality which is infinite, indescribable, and beyond all form, to that reality which is the true nature of every being, including ourselves. Why is this relevant to us? Because it accounts for all the variety of religions, for all the religious traditions and paths in the world. If one is intuitively attracted to this non-dual conception of reality, or finds it intellectually compelling, this needn't be to the detriment of the dualistic religions. Ramakrishna, speaking from experience, assures us that the religious traditions devoted to a personal God are not only acceptable, but for most people, maybe even all people, they are essential. Likewise, for those who gravitate to a personal conception of God, in the West at this time, I'm thinking of all those who are returning to the traditional religions of Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. In this case, the example of Ramakrishna can soften what would otherwise be a too severe insistence on the sole validity of one's own tradition. To me, at least, the sanctity of Ramakrishna is evident, both in his teachings and in his life. Likewise, his all-consuming love for God and his spiritual accomplishments both seem eminently genuine. Perhaps not everyone will have this perception. Many of us are, rightly, wary of false gurus. But for the one to whom Sri Ramakrishna has the character of a saint, even if not a saint from one's own tradition, this hints that the religions do converge, that God may be found and revered in many different forms. Note that this does not mean some kind of sloppy syncretism without real meaning or force, that only panders to the ego of the person who assembles it. In chapter 18 of the Gospel, Ramakrishna is clear, quote, "You should undoubtedly bow before all views, but there is a thing called unswerving devotion to one ideal. True, you should salute everyone, but you must love one ideal with your whole soul. That is unswerving devotion," end quote. Finally, it would be remiss of me if I stopped here after addressing only dualists and non-dualists. What about the atheists, to whom the whole dichotomy might seem meaningless? Here too, Ramakrishna can be helpful. The non-dual Brahman, it seems to me, is eminently compatible with a worldview devoid of all deities, in which only science and rationality are trusted. We are talking here of the ground of being. what allows for anything at all. We are talking about the unity of the universe, of the relation and fittedness of consciousness to reality. We are talking essentially about that which is no particular being, though indispensable to all beings. These are deep philosophical questions about which science can perhaps say little, if anything, but which in no way need contradict science. I think one comes closest to a bridge between non-dualism and a purely atheistic worldview in Buddhism, where the nature of all reality is precisely emptiness. Not nothing, not pure void, but also not any definite thing. This is remarkably similar to the outlook of modern physics, wherein virtually all of space, even that within solid objects, is empty, where everything can be conceived as interrelated fields of force, and where all of this is mysteriously intertwined with observation, if not consciousness itself. A non-dual worldview invites us to contemplate this most basic level of being, this mysterious ultimate reality, rather than regarding it, or effectively disregarding it, as a completely vacuous background to chunks of matter bouncing about. As John Vervaeke has argued, this non-theism, this transcending of the categories of theism and atheism, returns us to a sense of the sacred, though without requiring adherence to the systems of dogma and mythology that used to go along with it. Ramakrishna therefore offers us a vision of ultimate reality that can embrace all perspectives, from the most to the least religious, in a way that can help each make sense of the others. The atheist can understand the theistic religions as useful means for relating to, revering, and realizing this ultimate level of reality, and the devotees of different deities can understand each other as loving and serving the same ineffable God in different ways. Now, this might just sound like a claim that the non-dualist position is true, that the ultimate reality is impersonal and without form, and that the dualist devotion to a personal God is false, though useful. But this isn't quite right. As Ramakrishna insisted in chapter 8 of the Gospel, quote, God has form, and he is formless too. Further, he is beyond both form and formlessness. No one can limit him, end quote. This is where things get a little more interesting. For Ramakrishna, it seems Kali and the other deities didn't just exist in people's minds. There was a level of reality to them beyond this, though of course all of this is subsumed by the pure and absolute reality of Brahman itself. Yet, on the level of reality that all human beings dwell on, in which each of us and all the particular things of the world are real, the various forms of God are also real. Ramakrishna was clear that as long as I feel myself, an individual ego, the personal God also exists. There may then be a way in which the forms of God have an objective existence. The more skeptical could perhaps understand this in the way of Jungian archetypes, which have an objective coherence across many different minds, despite being mental and in that sense subjective. The more religiously minded may have a stronger way of understanding this. In any case, Ramakrishna didn't assert that God was simply formless. God both is those forms that people love and worship, and he is beyond even formlessness. That term is too limiting to describe him. Here's another quote from Sri Ramakrishna, which plays with that ambiguity as to how much of the experience of God's forms comes from us and how much from God himself. The quote is from chapter 6 of the Gospel. Quote, think of Brahman as a shoreless ocean. Through the cooling influence, as it were, of the bhakta's love, the water has frozen at places into blocks of ice. In other words, God now and then assumes various forms for his lovers and reveals himself to them as a person. But with the rising of the sun of knowledge, the blocks of ice melt. Then one doesn't feel any more that God is a person, nor does one see God's forms. What he is cannot be described. End quote. So far, this discussion of non-duality and devotion has been rather theoretical, but there are very practical reasons for a devotional orientation toward a reality that is ultimately beyond description. Ramakrishna taught that as long as the individual ego remains, it is best if it be the ego of the child or of the servant toward God. This ego is not harmful to oneself or others. Only the ego consumed by worldly attachments is harmful. And as I've mentioned, Ramakrishna himself preferred the state of bhakti, in which he remained an individual self adoring the Lord, rather than that highest state in which his individual self dissolved and he was lost in God completely. This despite already being enlightened as to the absolute identity of self and God. Finally, I want to talk about how Ramakrishna saw knowledge, or jnana, which highlights the importance of practice and experience. Here is what he said from chapter 21. Quote, "Some have heard of milk, some have seen milk, and some have drunk milk. He who has merely heard of it is ignorant. He who has seen it is a jnani, but he who has drunk it has vijnana, that is to say, a fuller knowledge of it. After having the vision of God, one talks to him as if he were an intimate relative. That is vijnana." End quote. This shows the futility of merely talking about God as an intellectual abstraction. What is essential is having a direct insight, not only that he is real, but that only he is real. After this comes something deeper and more complex. It seems that such a one has a kind of living relationship with God. This is another reason why it may not be sufficient to say that God is ultimately formless, impersonal, and realized through knowledge. Ramakrishna points to something beyond even this, though it is possibly fruitless to try to talk about it. What is fruitful is the love and seeking for God. Here's a quote in this vein from chapter 12. Quote, "Too much study of the scriptures does more harm than good. The important thing is to know the essence of the scriptures. After that, what is the need of books? One should learn the essence and then dive deep in order to realize God." End quote. I turn now back from God to the world. According to Ramakrishna, one may reach God by a process of negating the world. He mentioned the rational path of jnana, discriminating the one truly real Brahman from all that is only apparently real, though I would say this also applies in some way to the devotional path of bhakti, rejecting all one's worldly attachments for the sake of the singular love of God. Nevertheless, says Ramakrishna, when one realizes God, one realizes that God is also all of this. As he put it, as I quoted before, when I ascend via steps to the roof of a house, I must leave each step behind. But when I reach the top, I realize that the roof is made of the same materials as the steps. God and the world are one, though this can only be fully realized from the ultimate perspective, having reached God and freed oneself from attachment to the various particular things of the world. Expressing the same insight in the language of Hindu theology, Sri Ramakrishna said, quote, "Brahman and Shakti are identical. If you accept the one, you must accept the other. It is like fire and its power to burn. If you see the fire, you must recognize its power to burn also. You cannot think of fire without its power to burn, nor can you think of the power to burn without fire. You cannot conceive of the sun's rays without the sun, nor can you conceive of the sun without its rays." End quote. Brahman is God thought of as inactive, the pure principle of being that underlies everything. Shakti, which is a feminine principle and means energy, is God thought of as active, as actively manifesting itself in and as the world. Brahman is therefore the transcendent ground of being, whereas Shakti is the immanent world and the primal energy that animates it. The object that you see on the screen is lingam and yoni, a sacred representation of these two fundamental principles of being conceived as masculine and feminine. In one sense, this is a recapitulation of the insight that reality is non-dual, but it gives it an important emphasis. The world is a glorious expression of God, not merely an illusion, and not something evil to be escaped from. A prominent Hindu conception of the purpose of the manifest universe is that it is God's Leela, God's divine play. Ramakrishna gives voice to this in the following saying, quote, "The Divine Mother is full of bliss. Creation, preservation, and destruction are the waves of her sportive pleasure." End quote. I think this is a beautiful and compelling answer to the question of why the universe exists. It suggests that the purpose of its existence is itself, in all its creative dynamism, as the purpose of the music is the music itself, and the purpose of the dance is the dance, and the purpose of a child's play is the play itself. This doesn't negate, but flows from the bliss of the inactive aspect of God, the pure being and awareness of Brahman. When one attains to this, one realizes that this ultimate reality is also manifesting itself in all the tremendous energy of the universe. When one returns to the world from the realization of God, one realizes that God has become the world as well. To hint at something I'll cover at the end of this video, there is in this vision only affirmation. God affirming himself as Brahman, God as Shakti affirming all the glorious variety of creation, men reascending from immersion in this divine play to a realization of he who plays, not through hatred of the play, but through love of him. There are remarkable similarities, I think, between Jesus Christ and Sri Ramakrishna, though they come from completely different civilizations thousands of years apart. Noting these similarities, the French writer Romain Rolland once called Sri Ramakrishna the younger brother of Christ. And I think for us in the West, they can help illuminate the figure of Christ, who is at the very foundation of our civilization, whether one is a Christian believer or not. First, there is a striking similarity in the style of their teaching. Like Christ, Ramakrishna used parables and sometimes shocking analogies to convey his spiritual message. Consider the example I mentioned before, his comparison of a devotee of God who lives in the world to an unchaste woman always thinking of her lover. Jesus has many parables that are shocking, some of which have lost that effect because by now we've become too used to them. The parable of the Good Samaritan or the parable of the prodigal son, to many of us, just seem obvious now. But others preserve that quality of strangeness. The parable of the talents, for example, where God takes from he who has not and gives to he who has. Or the parable of the workers in the vineyard, shocking for an opposite reason. God gives each of the workers exactly the same wage, regardless of whether they've worked 1 hour or the entire day. Or perhaps the parable of the persistent widow, in which God is cast as an unjust judge who a woman pesters until she finally obtains justice. Sri Ramakrishna told a somewhat similar tale. This is from chapter 2 of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Quote, "We should force our demands on God. He is our father and mother, isn't he? If the son demands his patrimony and gives up food and drink in order to enforce his demand, then the parents hand his share over to him 3 years before the legal time. Or when the child demands some pice from his mother and says over and over again, 'Mother, give me a couple of pice, I beg you on my knees,' then the mother, seeing his earnestness and unable to bear it any more, tosses the money to him." End quote. Ramakrishna is here talking primarily about the demand for God to reveal himself to us. Just as in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus assures his followers the Heavenly Father will give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him. And now we are starting to get into the second point, the remarkable similarity of the content of their teachings. When Jesus was asked effectively to summarize his teaching, he cited these two commandments as the greatest. This is from Matthew chapter 22. The first and greatest: you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And the second greatest: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. We've already seen how the purpose of life for Sri Ramakrishna was to love, seek, and realize God, even that when he had realized God so fully that he lost all sense of personal identity, he preferred to come down a little, that there might be just enough distinction from him to love him. Ramakrishna would have wholeheartedly agreed with Jesus' great commandment. A corollary of this is clear. Both in Christ and Ramakrishna, love God and renounce all else. Jesus warned that we cannot serve two masters, for we will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. That we cannot serve God and mammon, a word indicating money and possessions. To the rich young man who asked him how he might have eternal life in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus told him, quote, "If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." End quote. Likewise, Ramakrishna constantly warned his disciples against the lure of woman and gold, the dangers of lust and greed. One must renounce these completely to realize God, whether this be the mental attachment to them, if one is a householder, or the literal renunciation of a monk. Regarding lust, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus has said something similarly extreme. Quote, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away." End quote. As for the second greatest commandment, love of one's neighbor, Sri Ramakrishna had this to say, quote, "Jiva is Shiva. Who then dare talk of showing mercy to them? Not mercy, but service, for man must be regarded as God." End quote. Jiva is the individual soul, and Shiva is the name for God. So Ramakrishna is saying that we should serve man as God. A Christian might object to this extreme degree of identification, but Ramakrishna fully understood the difference between an unenlightened and an enlightened soul. I believe this expresses, though in slightly different language, the Christian notion that everyone is made in the image of God. This saying of Sri Ramakrishna's was an inspiration for his chief disciple, Vivekananda, who made charitable work a central focus of the religious organization he founded, the Ramakrishna Mission. It might perhaps be objected that Sri Ramakrishna picked up Christian teachings, but this doesn't appear to be true. He had very little exposure to Christianity during the formative period of his life. The ideas he drew on had already existed within Hinduism for centuries, if not millennia, and virtually all his quotations are from Hindu sources. It's true that his disciples read passages from the Bible to him, and he came to revere Christ as an avatar of God. In this connection, I want to mention the following passage from chapter 5 of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which shows both a tension with Christianity and a consonance with its deeper message. "Once, someone gave me a book of the Christians," he said. I asked him to read it to me. It talked about nothing but sin. The wretch who constantly says, I am bound, only succeeds in being bound. He who says day and night, I am a sinner, verily becomes a sinner. One should have such burning faith in God that one can say, what? I have repeated the name of God, and can sin still cling to me? Surely this gets to the heart of Christ's message of the saving power of faith. So there's a great similarity in the content of the teachings of these two spiritual masters, just as there's a great similarity in their style. There seems also a great similarity in their character, their extreme sincerity, love of God, compassion, non-violence, renunciation. But what is perhaps most helpful in comparing the two is their experience. Here we have two men who experienced both extreme devotion to God at the same time as experiencing a certain identity with God. The Christian doctrine of the Trinity is one way to understand this, was, it seems to me, developed precisely to try and understand it, though it must also be said to terminate in mystery. I don't think many theologians claim that the Trinity can simply be rationally comprehended by the human mind, but I think Ramakrishna offers us a different way, a not necessarily contradictory, but perhaps complementary way to understand this. If God is ultimately non-dual, the only reality, then of course the spiritual master, the individual who realizes God most fully, realizes his identity with God. Ramakrishna shows that, nevertheless, devotion to God as someone other, as a king, a father, or in Ramakrishna's case, a mother, can not only lead toward this experience of oneness, but remain after it, interwoven with it. That Christ felt his oneness with God shouldn't, therefore, be surprising. There are other examples of this involving spiritual masters of lesser stature. Curiously, the most rigorously dualistic, monotheistic religion of Islam gave rise to the mystical Sufis, many of whom expressed extremely non-dual sentiments, sometimes even claims of identity with God, after realizing him via the path of intense renunciation and devotion. But this is just one level. It implies that the sense of identity with God is the result of spiritual accomplishment. But there is an additional level. In Hinduism, there is the doctrine of avatars, or incarnations of God. These are beings who descend, as it were, from the Absolute, rather than merely ascending to it. They come into the world for a purpose, to save people and teach and guide civilizations. Sri Ramakrishna always affirmed their existence, and at least hinted that he was such a being. If the story of his deathbed words to Vivekananda is true, eventually declared he was such a being. Christ too hinted at this, and perhaps also declared it, depending on which parts of the Gospels you credit as genuine and how you interpret them. Certainly, the early Christians felt that here was a being who had descended from God, not merely a man who ascended to him. It may be that these two conceptions aren't opposed to each other. Within the story of Christ, we can see the movement of ascent in his spiritual accomplishments. He did, after all, go through and overcome the devil's temptations in the desert, the agony in the garden, the sense of forsakenness on the cross. He was baptized, fasted, and prayed. There is a sense in which he sought and found God. But we can also perhaps see the movement of descent by the speed and ease with which he accomplished all of this, with the natural charisma that radiated from him, by the moral excellence that seemed to dwarf his surroundings. What the notion of avatars or incarnations perhaps expresses is precisely this inability to clearly distinguish, in individuals of immense spiritual stature, these two movements from each other. Have they gone up or come down, or both? The very nature of their going up implies their having come down. I should also mention briefly the issue of miracles. In Hinduism, as one nears enlightenment, one naturally attains certain supernormal powers. These are generally regarded as temptations, potential distractions from the ultimate goal of realization of God, abilities that shouldn't be indulged in. There are miraculous stories involving Sri Ramakrishna too. Of course, it appears Christ did perform miracles in abundance, and that if these powers exist, he actively used them, though never simply on demand or to aggrandize himself. He used them, we could say, precisely to help people to love and realize God. He rejected the alternative when he rejected Satan's temptation to turn a stone into bread when he was fasting in the desert. If such powers are possible, it may be that Christ, because of his spiritual accomplishment or divine nature, or both, was able to use them wisely. The resurrection from the dead would be the ultimate instance of this. The non-dual perspective may seem foreign to Christianity because of its strong dualistic devotionalism, but I would argue there are rather great affinities. First of all, the very notions of the Trinity, that God is three persons in one substance, and of the Incarnation, that Christ is both human and divine, these very notions are non-dual. With Christianity, this non-duality is confined to God and Christ, although in Eastern Orthodox Christianity at least, there is the notion of theosis as the ultimate aim of all human beings, becoming God or fully participating in God. There is also the notion of the Holy Spirit, which is God and yet indwells God's creation and all believers. I've sometimes wondered how, if Christ was God, including his body, how in this case the entire world is not also God, because Christ breathed, and in many ways exchanged the atoms and molecules of his body with his surroundings. At what point in space and time did they cease to be Christ and therefore cease to be God? It's not at all clear where a human being begins and ends. Are our gut bacteria ourselves? They are organisms themselves, but also part of us, and we need them to function. Are our immediate environments that support our physical life, our family and friends who support our physical and mental life, the systems and networks, natural and man-made, we are necessarily part of, are not these also, in a meaningful sense, ourselves? It seems to me that beginning with the non-duality of reality may help us understand the Incarnation more than beginning with its fundamental duality and making one crucial exception. Finally, I want to ask, what would Jesus Christ have been were he born in India? Even if he was God, he was born into flesh as well as into a culture. He used the language and symbols of his religious culture, of Second Temple Judaism, and in many ways remarkably transformed them. If he were born a Hindu, I think it's meaningful to ask, would he reject the entire religious culture and preach the Jewish scriptures without any exposure to them, or simply have nothing to say? Neither of those options seem too plausible. I think instead he would have used the language and symbols of that religious culture. He would have seen himself as a devotee of Vishnu or Shiva or Brahman. Can one imagine him in this milieu? For me at least, I very much can. I think he would have been very well suited to it, though the people, more accustomed to what he was expressing, may not have had the same violent reaction to him, for better or worse. Likewise, we can ask, what would Sri Ramakrishna have been in first century Judea? What would he have looked like? What would he have taught? What religious language would he have used? In this milieu, I see him looking very much like Christ. I turn now from Christ to someone who saw himself as the enemy of Christ. While Jesus Christ and Sri Ramakrishna beckon us toward the transcendent, the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche could be characterized as someone who utterly rejected the transcendent and sought to live only with the immanent, in other words, without appeal to abstract metaphysical entities. For this reason, I think he is emblematic of the non-religious or post-religious condition many of us find ourselves in, and in that sense I think he may be our greatest philosopher. One that we have partially but by no means sufficiently assimilated. For Nietzsche is not interested in merely analyzing reality or morosely bewailing the death of God in our souls, but is in actively embracing this post-religious condition and finding in it a way we can really live well. His answer is a challenge. Can we say yes to life? Can we live in such a way and be so disposed to life that we could say yes to living exactly the same life over and over again for eternity? This puts the focus on the actual, embodied life we lead, taking it away from some posited afterlife or some perfect abstract being that somehow transcends it all. For Nietzsche, the notion of life was basic, not Platonic ideas, but also not inert matter. Only life is truly immanent, the one thing always with us, the very thing we are. And the nature of life is will to power. the ceaseless impulse to grow, expand, exert itself, overcome, even overcome itself. Because this thing that we are isn't a thing at all, but a process and an energy. All is alive, all is energy. This is what I understand Nietzsche to have been saying. But this energy that animates all things, this is none other than Shakti. Nietzsche and Ramakrishna were contemporaries, although they never knew each other. While Sri Ramakrishna was teaching his disciples at Dakshineswar, Nietzsche was writing his magnum opus, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, on the shores of the Mediterranean. This work of philosophical narrative traces the journey of the protagonist, Zarathustra, toward making that ultimate affirmation of life I alluded to earlier, the affirmation of the eternal return of all things. At the book's climax, Zarathustra declares his love for and wins the hand of the woman, life. This magnificent woman, for whom all is divine play. To me, at least, this corresponds almost exactly to the Hindu conception of Shakti, God's immanent and feminine aspect, for whom Ramakrishna's Divine Mother Kali is one specific form. In the song that immediately follows this scene in the book, we hear the following, quote, "The world is deep, deeper than day can comprehend, deep is its woe, joy deeper than heart's agony. Woe says, fade, go, but all joy wants eternity, wants deep, deep, deep eternity." End quote. Even in the manifest universe, joy or bliss is fundamental, is deeper than suffering or woe. On the level of the creative energy itself, all is continual joy, though this, of course, is often agony and death to the creatures that are the momentary manifestations of it. I'm powerfully reminded of the quote from Ramakrishna I mentioned earlier, quote, "The Divine Mother is full of bliss. Creation, preservation, and destruction are the waves of her sportive pleasure." End quote. Neither Nietzsche nor Ramakrishna were naive strangers to suffering. On the physical level alone, we know that Nietzsche suffered from crippling headaches much of his life, and Ramakrishna died of throat cancer. Yet they both felt able to affirm the fundamental joy of manifest being, or at least participate in its self-affirmation as far as they were able. For both Nietzsche and Ramakrishna, at the heart of being is bliss. But for Ramakrishna, of course, this goes even deeper. This is the bliss of God's active aspect, but there is also the bliss of his inactive aspect, of Brahman, who is Sat Chit Ananda, being, consciousness, and bliss. This fundamental bliss of the ground of all being is the basis even of Shakti's joy in creation. Here is where the transcendent comes back into the picture. Thus Ramakrishna could be said to have a more complete picture of reality, one that includes not only the dynamic and immanent, but also its transcendent ground, and moreover, one that affirms both of these. Though, as far as humans are concerned, the transcendent God has the highest possible value, nevertheless, the manifest world is intrinsically valuable as God's self-expression. Not only is the manifest world beautiful in itself, and here I am reminded of Ramakrishna's first ecstatic trance upon seeing the white crane soaring against black storm clouds. Not only is the world beautiful itself, but it is the place from which we can love and enjoy God. The only place, in fact, closer than this, and we merge into or realize our identity with Him. From the human perspective, there is a problem with the relation between the transcendent and immanent aspects of reality, between God and creation. This is reflected in what's known as the problem of evil or the problem of suffering. The problem is that creation appears very different from its transcendent ground. Creation is such that bad things happen, that everything that lives suffers and everything that is born dies. The Western monotheistic religions address this by imagining a future time in which creation will be perfected, where, in the words of chapter 21 of the book of Revelation, quote, "Death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." End quote. But it's not clear how this could possibly happen. How could we be the beings that we are and yet immune from death and suffering? How could the energy of life in the universe not be continual transformation? I've gone into this problem in depth in my articles and videos on the violence of life and against eternal life, and my recent video on the necessity of suffering. The Hindu worldview, as summarized in Ramakrishna, offers a resolution by dissolving the problem. Violence, transformation, suffering, these are indeed constitutive of creation, and it doesn't make sense to posit a world without them. But at the same time, the pure being, consciousness, and bliss of Brahman timelessly subsists beneath them, and in an ultimate sense is all there really is. On the level of God, there is only bliss, the bliss of peace in his inactive aspect, and the bliss of play in his active aspect. Either way, as Nietzsche and Ramakrishna both affirmed, in the very structure of being, joy is deeper than suffering. Intriguingly, there's at least one place in Nietzsche's work where he seems to affirm not only the immanent energy of life, but also its transcendent ground. This is the 4th chapter of the 2nd book of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the chapter titled Before Sunrise. In this, Zarathustra offers a hymn of praise to the clear and open sky of morning twilight, when the stars can no longer be seen, but the sun has not yet risen. It begins, "O sky above me, O pure, deep sky, you abyss of light." He praises it for its vast and boundless declaration of yes and amen, and longs to bless all things like the sky does. To stand over everything as its own sky, as its round dome, its azure bell and eternal security. In other words, to let all things be the beings that they are. Nietzsche would likely object that this is not a prayer to a divinity, that it rather praises the opposite, the emptiness, the absence, the space that allows beings to be. But I would argue that considering God as the utterly transcendent, non-dual ground of all being, this comes to very much the same thing. Consider the Buddhist notion of fundamental emptiness and how close this is in turn to the non-dual Hindu conception of Brahman. I don't think Nietzsche was fundamentally against the sacred or divine. What he objected to so strongly were notions of the divine that polluted the pure sky with merely human ideals and preoccupations. For instance, the notion of the Supreme Being as someone who sits in judgment of the world and finds it wanting. These are the passing clouds decried in the same chapter, which float between earth and sky, casting shadows on the former and obscuring the latter. Nietzsche affirmed pure immanence and perhaps pure transcendence. What then of justice and moral goodness in general? Are human beings to give up our ethical values and act just the same as the rest of nature? The religions of the world are unanimous. Moral virtue is required of human beings and is indispensable for attaining God. But while it may be necessary, that does not mean it is sufficient, and the moral values appropriate to humanity may not characterize the absolute being himself. The Hindu doctrine of the 3 gunas may be helpful here. According to this, the entire manifest universe, psychic and physical, is composed out of 3 gunas or modes of nature. Tamas, which is dark inertia, Rajas, which is active passion, and Sattva, which is calm and luminous goodness. All of the gunas are necessary for our existence in the world, and yet God is beyond them all. As Ramakrishna taught in chapter 22 of the Gospel, quote, "The 3 gunas, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, have men under their control. They are like 3 brothers. As long as Sattva exists, it calls on Rajas for help, and Rajas can get help from Tamas. The 3 gunas are so many robbers. Tamas kills and Rajas binds. Sattva no doubt releases man from his bondage, but it cannot take him to God." End quote. We get a much more implicit hint of this, I think, in the biblical book of Job, where Job discovers God as both beyond and the origin of all these modes of nature. He is beyond even goodness, or to put it slightly differently, his goodness is a goodness that embraces both good and evil. And at the very same time, the story of Job makes abundantly clear both the duty for humans to be virtuous and the indispensability of human virtue in the ascent toward God. In the book of Job, it is clear that God demands goodness and is pleased by Job's goodness. Were it not for his goodness, the story suggests, God might never have revealed himself to Job, though this revelation shows God as a good that lies beyond good and evil. Against Nietzsche, then, we might maintain the importance of morality, though against Christianity, we might deny or qualify its ultimacy, its applicability to the very foundations of being or the ultimate reality. The holistic Hindu vision of Sri Ramakrishna, I think, provides a worldview that allows us to make sense of all of this. What then of us, we human beings who, like Job, even if not as dramatically, must pay the price of our apparent being? Here is where the in-between again becomes relevant, though not in a way that negates either the immanent or transcendent. Through the forms of God, whether they be our conceptions of him or his self-manifestations, or both, through the forms of God we can come to love him, and to some degree or other to realize him. Viewed non-dualistically, this is the coming into conscious relation of the ground of being with itself. Viewed dualistically, this is the salvation of the human soul. It does not need a new heaven and new earth to come at the end of time. The love of God can transfigure our lives in time, even as all the preconditions of relative being remain. This brings me finally to the issue that triggered this entire video, the role of individuality in relation to love. It might be objected that, in ultimately denying the reality of individual beings, the Hindu vision of Sri Ramakrishna ultimately denies the reality of love, despite encouraging his disciples to pursue love of God before identification with God and preferring this state himself. I've thought a bit more about this, and in response I would say, well, love is something of a mystery. It requires that beings be not utterly identical, but also not utterly separate. If utterly identical, they are simply the same being and there is no relation. If utterly separate, there is not even a basis for relation. I think the Christian proposition that the Trinity represents the love that is God is compelling. In this, the persons in relation are both distinct and equally identical. Likewise with the Christian notion of the incarnation, the relation between the divine and human natures of God's great devotee, Christ. While the Christian framework stops here, I would say that Sri Ramakrishna's worldview allows us to go further and apply it to all of reality. The ultimate level on which all this is one, and the ultimate level on which all is one, and all is God, is beyond the level on which we can talk about any particular being. It therefore doesn't negate their individuality, but enables their relation. With regard to men and the forms or manifestations of God, it enables our love. This vision of Sri Ramakrishna then is fundamentally affirmative of the transcendent God, the immanent world, and their relation. To those for whom religion has become irrelevant, I would say that Nietzsche shows us how to go all the way and purify ourselves from a moralizing that injects itself into the foundations of reality itself and judges existence no good. But once freed from this resentment, it seems to me that fresh spiritual horizons open up to us. Contemplating the wisdom and experience of a man like Sri Ramakrishna, at once so different and yet so familiar, we may come to see how notions like the sacred and divine are indeed meaningful. This may reinvigorate our appreciation for a traditional religion. may help us, for instance, to understand the luminous figure of Christ, or it may guide us on to something else. Nietzsche was, I think, to use the language of India, a lover and worshipper of Shakti. Through her, he attained, to some degree, the transcendent God himself. To truly love life, to truly affirm creation, is necessarily to overcome one's petty egotism and attain to the divine. The image here is of the Hindu god Shiva, husband of Shakti, in his aspect of Nataraja, or cosmic lord of the dance. I think it's incredibly fitting that in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche wrote the following: I would believe only in a God who could dance.